Ronan, Maria, and Asel began walking down the hallway together. Ronan walked a few steps ahead of them. As they walked, Asel asked Ronan what he was referring to. Both Maria and Asel stopped, uncertain of what Ronan meant. He stopped walking and, looking into their eyes, smiled as he explained that once they left the academy, it would take at least a week. He then asked Asel if he had classes. He thought to himself that Braum had often completed his course quickly, so it didn't matter. Turning around, he explained that balancing club activities and juggling simultaneously would be challenging, and the director would never allow it. Maria simply crossed her arms and continued listening. Asel, clasping his hands together, replied that he did have classes. Ronan clenched his fist, snapped his fingers, and asked them what the solution was. He then pointed to himself with his thumb, looked them in the eyes, and smiled as he explained that the solution was to complete the early courses, just as he had done, in order to be free. Several minutes later, they arrived at the training room in the club area on the second floor. Ronan stepped away from them, resting the sword on his shoulder. He explained that before starting private lessons, he needed to evaluate each of their skills. Looking into their eyes and holding the sword with one hand, he signaled for them to come closer with the other. With a smug smile, he told them to stop overthinking and come at him. He assured them there was no need to be afraid, as he would keep his sword sheathed. With a menacing expression, Ronan made a gesture of cutting his throat with his thumb and insisted they take it seriously, warning that it wouldn't be fun if they went too easy on him. Both of them were a bit puzzled by Ronan's attitude. Maria replied that they were going to take it easy. Then, looking into Asel's eyes with a smile, she called him sweetie and suggested they give it a try. Blushing and feeling quite confused, Asel looked back at Maria, unsure of what she was referring to. Seeing Asel's confusion, Maria explained that now was the perfect opportunity to show Ronan how much they had grown. Understanding at last, Asel clenched both fists, then extended his hands and activated his telekinesis, declaring that he was going to give it his all. Upon hearing this, Maria adopted an offensive stance, unsheathed her sword, and began channeling her mana. Raising the sword into the air, she initiated the fight by aiming at the ground. With a swift, forceful strike, she brought the sword down, shattering the impact area into small pieces. The blow was so powerful that it created a small curtain of smoke. Within seconds, the smoke reached Ronan, who was surprised by the considerable power of Maria's attack. At that moment, he glanced to the side and was left speechless, unable to believe what he was seeing. Gradually, the shattered pieces of ground that Maria had destroyed began to levitate in the air, surrounded by mana. It was Asel who was manipulating them. He turned towards Ronan, extended his hand, and said, "Watch this." As the pieces of ground floated around him, he signaled to Maria that he was ready to attack. With his hand extended toward Ronan, Asel caused pieces of stone from the ground to shoot towards him at high speed. The stones, surrounded by mana, gradually accelerated towards him. Ronan watched in surprise, amazed at Asel's newfound strength. In an instant, he effortlessly dodged his attacks and commended him for mastering telekinesis so quickly. With one hand on the sword, he swiftly struck all the stones with the still-sheathed blade, disrupting Asel's control over them. He praised him for his skill in using telekinesis. Then, he looked ahead and was amazed to see Maria taking advantage of his distraction from dodging Asel's attacks to approach him. With momentum building, she made a big leap towards him. As she closed the distance, she advised him to dodge her attack rather than block it. She tightly gripped the sword's handle and swung at Ronan. Fortunately, he reacted swiftly, dodging the attack at the last moment. Her sword struck the ground instead, creating a large cloud of smoke and damaging a significant portion of the floor. Observing the intense mana emitted by Maria's sword, Ronan smiled, realizing that had he not evaded the attack, he would have been as torn apart as the floor. Maria noticed that Ronan had dodged her attack, and she swiftly turned towards him with a fierce expression, readying herself to strike again. She lunged at him once more, but once again, he evaded her. As he observed the potent mana swirling around her sword, a smile crept onto Ronan's face. Seizing the opportunity while she was momentarily off balance, he gathered momentum and leaped forward, intending to strike now that her guard was down. She sensed the mana of his attack and blocked it just in time. Looking into his eyes, her expression shifted drastically as she quickly grasped Ronan's strength. As they sparred, Ronan looked up and smiled, pleased to see that both of them had surpassed his expectations. Asel flew towards them, using his telekinesis to grasp a large rock from the air. He instructed Maria to step back from Ronan. Then, extending his hand towards him, he directed the smaller stones to swiftly converge on his position. Without hesitation, Maria complied with Asel's command and moved away from Ronan. The stones struck near his position, forcing him to step back several meters. With a smile and a determined glint in his eyes, he began to draw his sword. Witnessing this, Asel decided to take action. He extended his hand toward him, propelling a massive piece of stone toward him at high speed. Gradually, the stone closed in on Ronan. Reacting swiftly, he unsheathed his sword and skillfully sliced the large stone into small pieces in an instant, watching as they fell to the ground. Ronan glanced aside with a smile. He continued to battle against them for several more minutes until they eventually overwhelmed. He knelt before them, meeting their gaze. With a smile, he commended them for their increased strength and dedication while he was absent. Asel excelled in defense, while Maria in attack, forming a formidable duo. Despite their determined expressions, Ronan praised Asel for his remarkable transformation. Upon hearing this, he blushed and thanked him. Seeing him kneeling, they asked if the test was over. Ronan closed his eyes, then rose from the ground with the support of his sword. He explained that he was satisfied now that he had confirmed their strength. He assured them that it wouldn't take much longer, perhaps just another month or two. Hearing this, both of them closed their eyes in relief, feeling exhausted from their intense bout with him. Ronan rose from the ground and began to approach them. They looked at him with confusion as he positioned himself behind Maria, the sword resting casually on his shoulder. With a mischievous gaze and a smile, he announced that their special training was about to commence right away. Upon hearing this, both of them grew anxious, their previously calm expressions now filled with fear. Maria questioned why they needed to continue training after their sparring session. Ronan gripped his sword and began to pursue them, stating it was of no consequence to him. In response, both of them started to flee. With a sinister smile, Ronan began striking them with his sword. As tears welled in their eyes, Asel cried out for help. From that day forward, Asel and Maria committed themselves to intense special training, even at the expense of their usual practice. Later, Ronan walked into the director's office and placed a stack of completed homework sheets on the desk. Witnessing this, the director was taken aback and met Ronan's gaze, questioning whether he meant everyone had finished their courses ahead of schedule. Ronan hadn't arrived alone. He was accompanied by all the members of his club. To his left stood Maria and Asel, visibly fatigued from their intensive special training. Maria signaled to the director with an affirmative gesture. On Ronan's right stood Braum, looking bewildered by Maria and Asel's exhausted appearance, unaware of what had transpired. Ronan placed his hand on the stack of homework sheets, closed his eyes, and with a serene smile, confirmed to the director that everything was indeed correct. He clarified that they had finished all the assignments for every subject. Then, he inquired if they were permitted to depart. The director gazed directly at him and commended him with a smile for consistently surpassing expectations. Folding his hands together, the director replied warmly that they were free to leave, as he had promised earlier, and would provide them with the necessary clearance. He bid them farewell and wished them luck on their adventure. The following day, the members of the special club, known as the Adventurers Club, embarked on their first activity. Ronan and the rest donned their adventurer gear and journeyed to the Vidian Mountains. Upon arrival, Maria gazed at her hand and noticed the potent mana coursing through the air and her own body. Seeing this, she turned to the others and inquired if this was the mystical energy they were seeking. Staring at her hand in disbelief, she marveled at the purity of the mana, astonished that it was so intense upon their arrival at the mountain's entrance. Braum crossed his arms, chuckled softly with his eyes closed, and enlightened her, saying that sensing the mana here was a significant aspect of their training already. He glanced ahead and queried Ronan about their next steps. As Ronan moved a bit away from the group, he responded, "Just wait here. Once we reach the center, I'll explain our next move." Meanwhile, as they conversed, a breeze started to pick up. Ronan then disclosed to everyone that there was something specific he needed to locate in this location. A few moments later, the wind swept towards a nearby house where Ronan and his companions stood. Inside, an elf heard the wind and turned towards the direction of the visitors. Near a rock sculpture, he stared intently, his expression hardening as he realized he had guests on his rugged terrain. With a determined look, he left his dwelling and made his way towards Ronan and the others, eager to greet the first visitors to the mountain in a long while. Everyone made their way toward the center of the mountain, and several hours later, they reached a peak. Ronan approached the edge and, gazing down, smiled, realizing he had found what he was searching for. In front of them lay an orc village, bustling with orcs going about their daily tasks. Ronan informed the group that this place was teeming with orcs. Braum approached, hand under his chin, and asked if the orcs had established a village. Ronan turned slightly towards him, met his gaze, and confirmed with a simple, "Yes." He added that in border areas where maintaining public order was challenging, it wasn't uncommon to encounter orc villages. Some of the working orcs noticed they were being watched and looked up towards Ronan and the others at the top of the mountain. Ronan explained to the group that the orcs had only managed to form a small village for now. However, due to their high fertility, it wouldn't be long before the orcs could overrun the entire mountain range. If that happened, the surrounding areas would suffer significant losses. Ronan aimed to eliminate the orcs before a tragedy occurred. Crouching down with his arm resting on his knee, he contemplated their next move. He turned to Maria and Asel, explaining that this would be their first battle together. Afterward, he asked if they understood the simplicity of the mission. Maria crossed her arms and stared directly into his eyes without saying a word. Asel clasped his hands together and began trembling at the thought of fighting against orcs. He looked Ronan in the eyes and, with a shaky voice, explained that when Ronan had mentioned orcs, he thought it would be just a few, not an entire village. Placing his hands on his abdomen and glancing towards the orc-filled village, he asked if the two of them would be okay. Braum, with a hand on his waist, turned towards Ronan. Ronan slightly turned his head and reassured Asel not to be afraid, explaining that the orcs were the perfect opponents for both of them. After saying this, Ronan gazed at the orc village with a serious expression, contemplating another variable. The dominant species in this mountain range, the ogres, were too formidable for even the orcs to capture, particularly their leader, the two-headed ogre. Ronan recalled his own encounter with this powerful foe, acknowledging that he hadn't been able to defeat him. For now, Ronan decided not to worry about the ogre leader, as he wouldn't appear until much later, making it a non-issue for the moment. Placing both hands on his knees, he stood up and asked everyone if they were ready to gradually eliminate the orcs. Before he could finish speaking, a figure wearing glasses appeared behind him, praising his good intentions and advising against attacking the orcs. The newcomer, a long-haired white elf with a backpack slung over his shoulder, addressed them as young adventurers and explained that this was not the right time to confront the orcs. Upon hearing the elf's voice, Ronan's expression shifted to one of surprise. He quickly turned his head toward the elf, staring into his eyes in speechless bewilderment. He wondered when the elf had approached and why he hadn't sensed his presence. As he pondered these questions, Ronan began to wonder about the elf's true identity. Noticing Ronan's confusion, the elf closed his eyes and, with a pleasant smile, reassured them that there was no need to be so cautious. When he opened his eyes and looked at them, he focused on Ronan's face. He smiled and disclosed that he was a priest residing in the mountains. Ronan stood up, faced him, and locked eyes, questioning if he truly was a priest. The elf placed his hands on his waist and affirmed that he was, explaining further that he served an ancient spirit named Senial. He also proposed they relocate for a safer discussion. Ronan gripped his sword with both hands and began to draw it slowly from its sheath. Before the elf could finish speaking, Ronan swiftly closed the distance, placing the sword at his neck and locking eyes with him, causing tension to hang in the air, Upon witnessing this, both Asel and Maria were rendered speechless. Asel blushed and stared intently at Ronan, wondering about his intentions. Maria also fixed her gaze on him and questioned his actions. Upon hearing Maria's inquiry, Ronan promptly apologized to both of them. With an intense gaze, he locked eyes with the elf and informed everyone about recent disturbances caused by a group of extremists. After stating this, he commanded the elf to listen closely and follow his instructions. The elf quickly understood that Ronan was serious. He raised both hands in a gesture of non-aggression and nervously assured him that he meant no harm, maintaining eye contact all the while. With a quavering voice, the elf asked Ronan what he meant. Ronan fixed him with a steely gaze and commanded the elf to say the words, "Ahayute is a bastard." The elf hesitated in silence, prompting Ronan to place his sword back at the elf's neck as a stern warning. Everyone present was taken aback by the tense situation. Several minutes later, they proceeded together towards the elf's temple. As they journeyed, the elf expressed disbelief to Ronan about being asked such a thing, especially given his service to God. Uttering those harsh words had deeply embarrassed him. The elf halted, covering his face with both hands, closing his eyes, and blushing deeply. It was a moment of great shame for him in the last 200 years. Ronan scratched the back of his head and glanced towards the forest, comforting the elf not to dwell on it, as the shout had been of sacred importance. With that settled, they resumed walking. Ronan turned to the elf and inquired about his age. The elf continued walking and admitted he had stopped counting long ago, so he wasn't entirely sure anymore. The elf disclosed to everyone that he was over 1,000 years old. This revelation left everyone speechless, halting their steps as they stared in astonishment. He approached a tree branch, closed his eyes with a joyful smile, and began gently touching and admiring the flowers. Ronan, looking at him with eyes wide in surprise, contemplated that the elf had lived since before the foundation of the empire. While the elf was distracted by the flowers, Ronan caught his attention and asked why he had mentioned it wasn't a good time to attack the orcs. The elf turned slightly towards Ronan, meeting his gaze, and explained that the monster's behavior had become peculiar lately. The orcs, typically not active at night, now roamed the mountains after dark, and the ogres, who usually stayed within their territories, had been spotted on the outskirts of the mountains. The elf gestured into the air, explaining to Ronan that since the cause hadn't been identified yet, caution was advisable for everyone. He decided it was best for everyone to relax for the moment. Using his mana, he touched the air with his finger, causing the magical barrier to begin dissipating. As the magical barrier slowly dissipated, Ronan and the others watched in surprise. The elf extended his hand to the side, and manipulating mana, instructed everyone to look ahead. They obeyed, and before them, a temple materialized seemingly out of thin air. The elf explained that this temple was called Lord Senial's temple. While Braum admired the temple, he remarked to Ronan that for a structure like this to suddenly appear, the magical barrier must have been exceptionally powerful. Asel also gazed at the temple in awe and speculated that if the elf could create such a barrier, his magic must be equal to or greater than that of the magic instructors. He walked up to Ronan and inquired if he had known about the temple from the start. Ronan continued walking and replied by asking if he hadn't noticed the surprised expression on his face. The elf turned towards them, closed his eyes with a pleasant smile, and invited everyone to enter the temple. As Ronan locked eyes with the elf, he discerned that this elf was far from ordinary. Several minutes later, everyone entered the temple and approached the rock. As they scrutinized it, Ronan asked the elf if this large, unassuming rock was the Senial they worshipped here. The elf smiled as he looked at the rock and explained to everyone that it held significant meaning. He considered that recounting this story might bore them all. Turning towards the group, he gestured for them to unpack their belongings and settle in comfortably, noting the ample empty rooms in the temple. He assured them that if they needed anything, they could approach him at any time. Upon hearing this, Maria glanced to the side, recalling something important. She nudged Ronan's shoulder and, locking eyes with him, asked if he wasn't also searching for something else in the mountains. Ronan met her gaze and inquired if she meant the habitat of the Cursed Eye. Upon hearing the name, the elf was taken aback. He looked at Ronan with wide eyes and asked why he was seeking out that monstrosity. Ronan returned his gaze and questioned if it was because of the curse afflicting him. Ronan's expression shifted dramatically. He locked eyes with the elf, his body radiating a menacing aura. He approached the elf and inquired how he knew about this. The elf placed his hand under his chin and stared intently at the ground, confirming his theory was correct. He explained to Ronan that he had deduced this from the peculiar and perilous aura emanating from him. With his hand under his chin, he lifted his head slightly and looked into Ronan's eyes, asking if he could have a moment to speak with him. Several minutes later, they strolled to the garden, settling at a table as the wind rustled around them, preparing tea. The elf disclosed that he had a premonition upon first seeing Ronan. He lifted the teapot and poured tea into the cup, telling Ronan he understood he wasn't an ordinary student like the rest. Ronan grew tense upon hearing this. He locked eyes with the elf, realizing he was being drawn into the elf's words without realizing it. He reached for his sword, questioning if he was overreacting. The elf closed his eyes, smiling as he poured tea into Ronan's cup. Ronan gazed into his eyes, pondering if this elf was truly connected to those individuals. He couldn't sense his mana and didn't react when Ahayute was mentioned. The elf delicately placed the teacup on a saucer and observed Ronan, sensing his preoccupation. Handing him the teacup, he suggested that having some tea might ease his mind. Ronan stayed silent as the elf approached with the teacup. As the elf placed the teacup beside him, Ronan peered into its reflective surface, pondering if the elf had tampered with it. Gradually, the aroma of the tea began to fill the air, leaving Ronan speechless as he watched the fragrant steam rise. Looking up at the elf, he realized he had never experienced this particular tea's scent before. At that moment, Ronan was surprised by what he witnessed. The elf placed both hands on the table, closed his eyes, and a smile spread across his face. Slowly, his body began to emanate with mana, while Ronan watched in astonishment. He started to ponder if the tea itself held the same pure flow of mana as the elf displayed. While lost in his thoughts, Ronan was startled when the elf spoke up, asking if he enjoyed the aroma of the tea. Ronan tightened his grip on his sword, feeling an unease creeping over him as he met the elf's gaze. The elf leaned in with an intense stare, his expression turning sinister as he repeated his question about the tea's scent.